Well, good afternoon, everybody, to almost the last, but certainly not the least session of the WTO Public Forum on the WTO's role in telecommunications and reinforcing development, innovation, and a resilient economy. If you think you're here for something else, I'm sorry, but this is much more exciting than anything else going on in this building right now. So you're in the right place. And I'm joined by a really great cast of characters in my panel this afternoon, who I'm going to introduce in a second. But I think we all know just how critical telecommunications services are to the functioning of the modern global economy. Those services underpinning the internet, digital trade, revolving modern economies, and of course, our every waking hour through Zoom, Netflix, etc. And although telecommunication services have been around for over 100 years now, in one form or another, their importance has obviously grown immensely and will continue to do so by powering emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence. And we have, of course, all seen that those telecommunications have come into their own during the COVID pandemic, keeping families, colleagues connected despite restrictions on travel and our ability to leave our own homes. So for our own part, the UK has played a leading role in telecoms, indeed, from the days of Mr. Baird and others, through to our work in telecoms liberalisation. The UK chaired the WTO telecommunications discussions that led to 69 members of this organisation opening up their telecommunications markets to international competition. However, that was many years ago, 25 years ago, time when the idea of a mobile telephone, let alone a social media influencer, was but the work of science fiction. It's time to refresh these rules to reflect the advance of telecommunication services and their impact on the global economy. And that's why we are working closely with the European Union, Norway, and Ukraine to drive forward work through the WTO joint initiative on e-commerce to update that WTO reference paper on telecommunications services. We think that doing so, of course, would support competition in the sector and would deliver widespread benefits for the digital economy and beyond. But don't believe me, believe or listen to the excellent panel we have assembled for us this afternoon. We have Bernadette Lewis, who's the Secretary General of the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organisation. We have to my right, Lee Tatil, who was a former member of this very organisation, former councillor in the Trade and Services Division of the WTO with specific responsibility for e-commerce and telecommunications. So most of us here will never even learn as much as Lee has forgotten about this subject. We have Gordon Moyer, who's a partner, lawyer, and telecommunications regulatory expert at Wigan LLP. And we have Leona Mentz, who's a regional operations manager and data protection lead at BT. So without further ado, I'm going to turn first of all to Bernadette, who you can see behind me, or if you're joining us online on your screens, to kick us off this afternoon. I wondered, Bernadette, I mentioned those kind of enormous societal and technological changes that have occurred in the last 25 years. If you were trying to kind of develop a reformed reference paper, what are kind of some of the elements that you'd like to see there, and how do you go about the kind of the big issue, which I suppose is such an acute issue for members of the Commonwealth, which is bridging the digital divide, particularly the access to broadband across developed and developing countries? That's not two rather large questions for you to answer in the next 5 minutes. But Bernadette, over to you. But Bernadette, I'm afraid it's one of those moments that we have grown all too used to over the last year and a half. You are, I'm afraid, on mute.
Mortal sin.
Something which most of my team wish I was on most of the time.
Oh, I do apologize. Thank you for the opportunity for the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organization to be represented here at this discourse. I would like to preface my remarks by reminding the audience of Article 19 of the United Nations International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And it states that everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art, or through any other media of his choice. And this statement speaks to the right of every individual to communicate. And in this regard, it is incumbent on the powers that be, the organizations and persons of influence in this area, to ensure that the means for communication are available to all. The ability to communicate is essential for increasing awareness, building capacity, facilitating participation in community and national life. We have seen broadband services become essential for social and economic activities. Studies have shown that an increase of 10% in fixed broadband penetration could yield an increase of up to 1.5% in GDP per capita. Now, following the conclusion of the 1997 World Trade Organization negotiations on trade in telecommunication services, many governments committed to the legally binding, wide-ranging liberalization methods for basic telecommunication services, and also to the reference paper on regulatory principles. These countries began establishing the independent regulatory authorities needed to liberalize their telecommunication markets. Some 25 years on, the markets have achieved some degree of liberalization. State-owned monopolies have given way to competitive service providers. There is competition of sorts and also consolidation. In addition, wireless services have exploded, supplanting fixed line services. International connectivity has improved significantly, but universal affordable connectivity at the national level remains a challenge in many countries. But most significantly, the technological landscape has experienced a sea change. We have seen the convergence of formerly distinct disciplines of information technology and telecommunications technology. Service-optimized networks have given way to unified multi-service networks based on the internet protocol, so that voice, video, data, text, and broadcasting, virtually anything that can be digitized can be carried on a single network. Services can now reside not just in physical infrastructure, but in the cloud. The Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, machine learning, software-defined hardware, low and medium Earth orbiting satellites, they are changing the very nature of the industry and contributing to greater degrees of development. The ability to create, access, and disseminate information has been democratized. In addition, new and unexpected players are now able to capitalize on these networks to create and to provide a myriad of new services, hazards, and threats. The demand for bandwidth is insatiable. Consumers are more discerning, they are educated, or they are intuitively en courant with the capabilities of the technology. They are innovating, they're experimenting. And today, anyone can enter the ICT service provision market. The rise in extra-jurisdictional service providers and players is presenting challenges for traditional service providers and regulators. And continuing rapid technological innovation has propelled the world into the fourth industrial revolution, where the physical, the digital, and biological realms coalesce. All aspects of everyday life, the good, the indifferent, and the bad, are being increasingly, inextricably enmeshed in information and communication networks. These phenomenal developments are precipitating fundamental changes in network topologies, in use cases, and service delivery. And given the dynamism of the current technological landscape, the uncertainty precipitated by this period of a pandemic, the imperative for digital transformation, and the inevitable challenges which will face us in the future, a new regulatory evolving philosophy will be required in order for the WTO to continue meeting its goal to improve the welfare of the peoples of its members. And I will end my brief remarks with that and return to you, moderator. Thank you.
Bernadette, thank you for setting us off in both such kind of eloquent and passionate terms, and starting off kind of with rights, not often heard about in this organization. So I thought it was a great way to kick us off, and lots of food for thought from it. I'm now going to turn, physically at least, to my right, to Lee Tuthill. As I said earlier, I think it would be something of an understatement to say that Lee was very closely involved with the negotiations which resulted in the WTO reference paper on telecom services. Almost should kind of bear her name, possibly. But I mean, looking back at it, Lee, I mean, and what has been achieved since, do you want to say a word about kind of what you think that reference paper has achieved for businesses and consumers? And perhaps kind of the tricky question, why is it that despite those benefits, some countries have adopted it, but others have not? What's held them back?
Let me, thank you very much, Ambassador. Let me address this by dealing with asking myself 3 questions, very simple questions. One, I think goes right to what you have asked me, is that, you know, were these a success? And I think the answer, simple answer is yes. And there's a number of reasons they were a success. Around the world, telecom reform laws didn't even exist in many cases while we were negotiating. And when these laws were drafted, the telecom provisions, both of the reference paper and the earlier annex on telecommunications were written into laws. Second of all, implementation was quite high because there was a lot of bilateral technical assistance, and the ITU had projects to help governments implement the kinds of principles that are in the reference paper and in the annex on telecommunications. And that was sought after technical assistance. Finally, another reason they were a success is that a lot of the regulatory agencies were new. They were looking for a blueprint. And I think even the ITU has agreed that the reference paper provided a blueprint for reform in when it could be a time when it could be confusing, because there was a sort of a British model, there was a US model, there was a Japanese and Canadian model of reform that all were quite different. And I must say, I remember hearing regulators say they would waive it at meetings to convince the government that this was something that had to be done. And business people told me they carried it around in their briefcase in case they had a problem. They'd pull it out and tell the government, well, you're not supposed to be doing this to me. Are they future-proof? And this is getting closer to the ambassador's mention of possible reforms. And here I have a qualified yes. To some degree, they are future-proof, partly because we talk today about silos, and silos perhaps making it difficult in the digital area to collaborate across so many different communities. In fact, these were negotiated by telecom regulators and telecom officials, they weren't always regulators then, and the trade people shoulder to shoulder, negotiating them together. And in some cases, the competition authority was engaged and involved and coming to Geneva as well. But every single meeting on these involved 2 representatives at a minimum from governments from both the telecom and the trade side. Another reason that's somewhat future-proof is that it was the first sector to come up with the concept of technological neutrality and put it in writing. So there is a chairman's note that the chairman at the time was your British national you're referring to. It was put into writing that this sector would be technologically neutral in terms of the services. And that means that the reference paper can apply to broadband, it can apply to mobile and other services. And finally, I think because the core of these disciplines, both of the telecom annex and the reference paper, is to provide competition safeguards for the trade in telecom. Competition safeguards, I think we all realize, are just as important, if not more so today than they were even then, as important as they were. And the final question I'll ask myself is could they be improved? And that is also a yes. The reference paper has a certain living body to it because it was drafted in very generic terms that could be adapted to new situations. But it can't fully be adapted in large part because the scope as an accident of history is limited to basic telecom. One of the things being proposed by the EU and the UK is that the scope be expanded to at least cover all of telecommunications, which are so highly blended today, it's probably very difficult to adopt regulatory environments without looking at the totality of the telecom services. And here, just let me remind you that that would relate to not only the side of the kinds of companies on which obligations are imposed by governments to ensure that they don't behave in anti-competitive practices of very kinds, but the beneficiaries. Right now, the annex, only basic telecom suppliers can benefit from these controls put on the competitive behavior of suppliers. If it's expanded, all kinds of telecom entities could benefit from these rules. And let me close there because I think we have a lot we can come back on.
Lee, thank you very much for setting that all out so clearly. I should have, by the way, reminded people at the start that they can send in questions online, which indeed many are doing, and we will come back to those questions in a moment. But I'd like to turn the floor to Gordon Ware, as I said at the start, lawyer, Wigan LLP, and a great expert in this area. Gordon, you work for many of the leading telecoms providers, regulators, and governments. Could you go say a word? I pick up, I suppose, also my question to Lee about sort of the difference in the way that states have responded. Can you say about a word how these rules have been applied in different regulatory environments and what we can kind of learn from that moving forward? You there, Gordon? Gordon? If we have momentarily lost contact with Gordon, what we're going to do is we're going to come back to Gordon in a second. But I'm hoping I'm going to have better luck with my fourth panelist, which is Leona Mentz, who is with BT. Leona, are you there? Leona?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Splendid. That was an agonizing moment there for a second. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Leona Mentz of BT, as I said. The pandemic, which of course continues to rage so fiercely where you are based, has really brought home the importance of technology and digitalization, as I said at the start. How do you see kind of telecom services helping to build resilience in global trade?
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and apologies, for some reason I couldn't unmute, but I'm happy that you can hear me now. I think perhaps if we just look at the time that this reference paper was negotiated, I think the world would be almost unrecognizable if by millennials today, because there were, as Lee rightly said, you know, the markets had limited competition, new entrants were going to struggle to compete with entrenched operators in that year. I mean, around about that time, the year 2000, less than 7% of the world had access to internet. And today, over half of the global population has access to the internet. And in 2 decades, cell phone subscriptions increased from 740 million to more than 8 billion. And one more point is that technology has become more personal and portable. It's quite hard to imagine that the first iPhone was sold only in 2007. But these changes led to a world in which technology touches nearly everything we do. And the essence of communications through the past 2 centuries has been telecommunications. It has been there to relay messages through all these developments that I've just mentioned, but also through crises. And I recently read an article where they said that, you know, just as we refer in the 20th century to pre-war and post-war, we'll probably, few generations to come will probably refer to pre-COVID and post-COVID times. You know, because this pandemic has amplified the urgency of profound and accelerated reinvention, but it's also illustrated that there's a possibility for us to operate completely differently from how we used to do it. And still telecommunications is the cornerstone. So in a world of lockdowns and where people had to physically distance, and almost every aspect of human interaction moved online. And in at least 3 ways, I think telecommunications kept economies going by providing business critical connectivity and resiliency, facilitating work from home arrangements, keeping individuals and societies connected, giving them access to medical services, financial services, e-commerce blossomed. And bandwidth, what we've seen is bandwidth heavy activities like remote learning, gaming, and video conferencing have grown dramatically. So BT is a global company, as you know, and we serve multinational customers in 180 countries. We run one of the largest global networks, and we're amongst the top data movers in the world. So for our customers, we carry all their data, voice, text, images, video. And in the context of the pandemic, what we've seen is that our customers' behavior leapfrogged between 5 and 10 years. And surveys that from other professional, services companies that I've seen have indicated that we're expected to see an increased migration of assets to the cloud, creating demand across both operator and adjacent value pools. And BT's helped our customers by quickly delivering increased bandwidth during this time, changing the way in which we provide the services that we provide to our customers so that it's done in a regulatory compliant manner. Also making complex changes to their networks remotely, through this difficult situation. And what we've seen is we had to rely, because we don't have our own network everywhere, we've had to rely on local networks to service some in other countries to service our business customers, similar to how in the UK our competitors are able to use our network. And maybe just on that point, it's interesting to note that tech companies such as Tencent and Amazon have increased their investments by more than 30% in 2020, while telco operators reduced their capital expenditure investments by around 2%. And you may wonder what the driving force behind it is. And really, telcos no longer view their infrastructure assets as differentiators. Whilst tech players take an ecosystem-focused view, driven not by a plan to resell, but rather to service their own bandwidth needs. And the reason I'm making this point is that the pandemic has exacerbated difficult economic conditions driving the digital divide. So as economic contractions took place, there's slower growth, rising unemployment, there were significant economic challenges faced by digital service users. And it's widened the divide in the availability and quality of connectivity between markets, but not only markets, also individual markets. And we've also seen that 5G delivery has been delayed significantly. So when an operator is faced with a decision to enter a market, is something that we regularly have to consider. You have to look at who it is that you're partnering with, and if you decide to get an authorization or a license, what information is available, and what we really need is clear information regarding timelines and licensing costs, an up-to-date list of licensees in case you want to partner with a local licensee, clear indication of the qualifying criteria such as local ownership requirements, the terms and conditions such as rollout obligations, minimum staff requirements, the dispute resolution mechanisms that's in place, and also, if all of this could be online, it would be much preferred. So what's really needed is transparency and a crystal clear regulatory regime, because that would make all these decisions much, much easier. And that is not the case currently in a number of markets. I know Bernadette earlier referred to some of the ITU statistics, and basically they estimate that over 4 billion users are currently on the internet. Well, that was in 2019, and 3 billion of them in developing markets. But despite the progress, there are still many businesses and individuals that remain disconnected, 3 billion, more or less. And it's a significant number. In Africa, out of a population exceeding 1 billion, only 294 million have access to the internet. And that is why, technology is supposed to be a great enabler and not a source of division. So this pandemic showcased weaknesses in our current approach. It also showed that, and if unaddressed, I am concerned that the digital divide will widen. But it's also shown that we have the incredible capacity to adapt and change. Therefore, I think, subject to some of the points that Lee made, there is no better time to reform the reference paper than now. Thanks, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Leona, for setting out the practical lived experience of one of the world's biggest telecoms companies so clearly, and particularly kind of capturing that, the extraordinary changes that the pandemic has ushered in, as well as kind of your needs as a telecoms provider from the regulations and the reference paper. I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to turn to Gordon again and find that he's now there. Gordon, are you with us? Can you hear us? Gordon? Okay. Okay. If he's not, let us We will continue, and actually we've got some great questions in from some of the people who are joining us online. Or perhaps they're actually in the room and pinging me messages from inside the room. You never know these days. That's the glorious world of telecoms. One of the questions that both, I think all three of you actually have kind of spoken about the role that the WTO could play in this. I've got a couple of questions in from people saying, well, isn't this actually much more the business of the ITU? So why is this not being done in the ITU? Or why is this not being done as a collaboration between the ITU and the WTO? Or what's the different added values of the two organizations? So I'm going to turn from an entirely dispassionate, objective view on the relative roles of the two organizations to a former employee of the WTO. Lee.
Actually, these kind of questions came up the minute the WTO started negotiating on opening telecom markets at all. And even within the ITU, there were different views on this. And it wasn't a lot of thinking about it at the WTO because we knew we covered trade. In fact, there's a lot of cooperation and collaboration between the ITU and the WTO. A lot of it is indirect, and to the extent that it's more direct, I mean, people like me and others working directly with ITU secretariat staff, it's very quiet. But the ITU played a major role, and it will always have more of a role than the WTO in helping governments work at the more detailed level. For example, in terms of calculating cost-oriented interconnection, and that's something that was so critical to implementation of the interconnection disciplines on the reference paper. The ITU has done seminars all over the world on cost calculation models and how to do them, and the advantages and disadvantages of different models. And for example, the WTO didn't tell you what model to use, or even when we had a dispute settlement case successfully negotiated, we still didn't suggest that any particular model had to be used to meet the obligations. So that's just one example where obviously the ITU cannot negotiate trade principles, and the WTO does not create standards. We require transparency, but we don't create them, and ITU still very much has that role.
Great. Ambassador, if I could just jump in here.
Yes, no, you can. I was about to ask you to jump away.
Well, what we are trying to achieve, it is a collective responsibility, and no single organization could cover all the bases. So it calls for greater degrees. So I absolutely agree with Lee. I absolutely agree with her. But there needs to be, we need to foster mechanisms that would facilitate greater levels of collaboration and cooperation across the board. No single organization could cover all the bases. And therefore, those collaborative mechanisms need to be put in place to facilitate, a more seamless, more harmonized, perhaps, approaches to what we are attempting to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernadette. I have a couple more questions to come back to in a second, and please do keep them flowing. But I'm reliably informed that Gordon may have joined us now. So I'm going to try and see if third time is genuinely lucky in this event. Gordon, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Ah, excellent. Yes, we can. Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. My question to you kind of earlier, which you may or may not have heard, was to say, I mean, we've obviously heard from Bernadette and Lee and Leona from different perspectives, Commonwealth, WTO, business. You obviously advise many of the world's kind of leading telecoms providers and regulators and governments. How have these rules set out in the reference paper been applied in different regulatory markets, and what lesson do you take from that as we look at the possibilities for revising and updating that reference paper in a kind of reformed document?
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. I mean, the reference paper has been exceptionally positive and has given strong guidance to governments and to regulators as to what the core principles should be, and particularly those principles that will incentivize investment, and particularly increase competition, which is what almost all of my clients are looking for, is a better range of services to buy, particularly those previously monopoly inputs, so they can roll their services out across the world and increase take-up of these new digital services that we're all reliant on. Some of us finding more challenging today than others, but these critical digital services that we absolutely require. And the reference paper has been useful. The challenge always is, even with the degree of detail in the reference paper, the complexities of applying those rules on the ground are high. So you do get a bit of a patchwork quilt of obligations in different jurisdictions. But the core principles, particularly of non-discrimination, market access, and transparency, are key. And I did quite a lot of work when I was in my previous role and with clients now. And there's a really strong correlation between effective application of the reference paper and the regulatory principles in that paper and investment. So, very, very binary, but where you see good levels of competition in access to infrastructure and good application of those rules by a well-resourced regulator, you do see intensified investment in that jurisdiction and greater take-up of telecom services. So there's a really good and strong correlation between applying those rules and seeing better competition and therefore better services on the ground.
Thank you very much. One of the other, Gordon, thank you for that. One of the other questions that's kind of come in is about the specific question of how including a telecoms reference paper, including the telecoms reference paper, or an updated version of that in the JSI on e-commerce here at WTO could help address some of the issues that our panelists have identified. Who wants to have a go at that?
Gordon might have.
Gordon, have a. Why don't you have a view? Go on.
The double whammy. Thank you.
Double whammy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is actually worthwhile looking at the rules. I worked on a very, very early use of the reference paper in New Zealand in about 1999, when we were looking at the application of those rules, and the regulator picked them up. And we saw a sea change in the market there, from a monopoly provider through to quite an advanced regulatory regime. And based on the reference paper and taking due account of the fact that New Zealand had signed up. But even then, and this is a long time ago, the sort of definitions in the paper were already somewhat outdated. And we're seeing technology move forward so quickly at the moment. I mean, the services that are being offered in the market now are, every year they're changing dramatically, and we're seeing new players in the space coming in all the time. There's almost all the services are computer driven or cloud based, even from the traditional telecoms operators. And as such, I think the definitions in the existing reference paper are substantially out of date, and there needs to be a much more technology neutral application of the paper to make sure that we see the best application of the rules and all the principles that we like transparency, I said, non-discrimination, applied across a much broader range of services, so that we do see the benefits for businesses and for consumers of getting effectively better access to the wires and the services and the infrastructure that will allow competition, particularly at the retail level, so we can all have the broadband speeds, the broadband services, the new generation of services and cloud services that we need. So I think the proposal to broaden out and make more technology neutral the obligations is welcome.
Thank you very much. I wonder if kind of Leo wants to add anything. I'd be interested then hearing from Leona about kind of what business would be looking for.
No, just quickly, I agree with Gordon, and even beyond that, as you can see the innovations done in some of the FTA chapters on telecom, as well as the proposal of that is before the e-commerce group. perhaps not so much out of date, but one of the criticisms of the reference paper, sometimes from developing countries, but also from lawyers, is it wasn't specific enough. To some degree, I thought being generic helped allow for regulatory innovation. On the other hand, there are whole families of regulation like local loop unbundling and number portability that weren't addressed at the time, and that can be addressed now because they've become a very common form of regulation. So just to add that, you know, there's not only updating, but perhaps new regulatory practices that have emerged and aren't reflected.
Thank you, Lee. Leona, just in your take on this, and in particular, kind of looking for kind of practical examples of areas in which you would hope either revised WTO references paper or indeed kind of its inclusion in the e-commerce GSI could actually help you as a company, and indeed, in due course, help your clients, customers.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, I kind of have to echo what Gordon has said, and I absolutely also understand Lee's point. So from a practical perspective, where we have run into serious difficulties is just very unclear licensing regimes. We've had instances where we've submitted an application and the regulator just took so long because there's no requirement for a timeline. So something as simple as that in the meantime, the qualifying criteria changed, and a year later, when they were finally considering the application, we no longer met those requirements, and we had to again decide whether we want to enter the market now based on these new requirements. So it's potentially little considerations like just timelines, getting a commitment in terms of timelines, that makes a huge difference in terms of whether you may ultimately enter a market or not. So from a business perspective, I really think that there's a lot more clarity needed, and that will make all the difference in terms of investment decisions. So yeah, I think, as I've mentioned, its timelines is quite important, qualifying criteria. Gordon may have touched on it as well, just in terms of, if there are local ownership requirements, those are sometimes quite onerous and makes it very difficult to justify entering into a market when you don't have any control, because often it is more than 50% local ownership for a foreign entity to enter a market. And those kind of things makes it really difficult. So having clear rules up front makes a real big difference to business. Yep.
Thank you, Leona, for the very clear answer on that. Bernadette, do you have kind of thoughts on that, particularly perhaps in the perspective of someone who's got to look at the needs of both developed and developing countries?
Right. Yes. I absolutely think, I'm satisfied in my mind that the reference people, the principles are correct. They are relevant. But we are in an environment that is now technologically very, very different. And, there are issues concerning, like dominant players. And when you look at developing some of the developing countries, like Commonwealth countries, the dominant player isn't necessarily within the national environment. They could be the big tech players that are having a significant impact on the domestic market. And these are things that I think should be addressed. And also for very small developing countries that may want to have, and in which you have perhaps many regional or global service providers, the question is how, as a national regulator, do I regulate an entity that is operating in a regional environment? And I want to go back to there needs to be greater degrees of collaboration and cooperation, especially at the regional level. We are in a globalized environment. And from the regulators in developing countries, it is a challenge. It is a challenge to really ensure that the consumer is adequately served. And I think in any reform going forward, the greater emphasis has to be on consumer protection because of the convergence of so many things on these telecommunication networks. You could speak about terrorists using the internet, bad actors, all of these things. And not just there's an obligation, I believe, from the regulator, but then there's also a need for collaboration between different sectors, so that the ICT regulator should be dealing with the Ministry of National Security, as you know, and there are a lot of these, everything seems to be converging. It gets very much more complicated, but these are the realities of the environment that we operate in. And you know, we really have to be innovative in our thinking to ensure that the rules that we put down now are going to serve us now and in the future. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Bernadette. I wonder if we can, just to sort of, as we sort of move towards the end here, just kind of look forward, each of us, to sort of, and kind of more broadly talk about how we see the role of telecommunications in this sort of building back better from the present pandemic. How do you see the kind of telecoms providers kind of working with governments and regulators to help us build back better from this pandemic? Can I perhaps start with Leona as the voice of business?
Thank you very much, Ambassador. One of the points that I think I do want to make before I go into very much more business-oriented response is that what we have found is that the uptake of services are really very much impacted by people's digital skills. And therefore, collaboration, I think, between various entities in a country is really needed to make sure that people do trust technology and that they embrace it, and that they, you know, these opportunities to enhance those digital skills. Because if we, for example, go into another similar type lockdown scenario or pandemic, you know, it was found through the studies during this pandemic that economies where people are able to where they have good connectivity, where people have digital skills, they could mitigate up to half of the economic shock of the pandemic. And it's just something that I thought was just quite an important point to make, that, you know, it requires quite a holistic approach if you want to make a difference, you know, to a country, to the globe, and to people. And if you want to prepare for a response to a pandemic such as this. And then as I said earlier, you know, we would continue to need a reduction of the barriers to entry. That is really quite, I think, really quite important from a business perspective. We've seen interesting phenomena during this pandemic that is perhaps just worth mentioning in passing, is the semiconductor chip shortage. Because of that impact, and some of the, I think Goldman Sachs actually estimated that it impacted 169 industries. And this created more barriers to entry in terms of access to the internet and other technological abilities to roll out infrastructure, because a lot of equipment actually require these semiconductor chips. And it's even widened the digital divide even more. So, you know, a holistic approach, I think, is probably going to be my answer from a business perspective, to make sure that all of the moving parts work together to improve on access to markets and providing services in markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lee.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, listen, I know we keep talking about the acceleration of the digitization of customers and going digital. I think the same acceleration, if you want to look at it from the point of trade, the same acceleration has happened in amongst businesses. And I think that for this reason, the recovery and resilience of the global economy and international trade will rely very much on telecommunications, ensuring that that acceleration of services can be satisfied in the future and satisfied at prices that are affordable enough that SMEs can continue to go digital as well in a way that will be effective and allow them to participate in the global economy more fully.
Thank you. Gordon.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think there's two things coming at it from the regulatory perspective and what my clients are looking at. Firstly, I think there is obviously a huge concern around national security issues and encryption and other both consumer protection, but also national security issues. And those are legitimate, but I think there's a real plea for those not to be over applied and preventing proper competition in the markets, and regulation for those issues has to be done very much in the vein of that national security rather than spilling over into wider areas. For example, national security requirements or inability to enter a market without having a certain number of locals on the boards, etc. And we're seeing that across the world. These new national security rules that will constrain competition. And I understand the rationale, but there's a risk of them being applied too widely. And the second thing I would say again is, given the vast number of new players in the space providing services, some more uniformity of the application of the rules to those market players, because we have got, as you and I will all know from our devices, we have a range of mechanisms for communicating now, but they're all regulated in a very different way. And just having some more clarity and uniformity around how those services are being regulated will make their rollout actually quicker and better and give us a better outcome for consumers and businesses. So those would be my two. There are many, but those are the two headline ones I'd like to flag.
You're allowed three if you want, by the way.
That's kind of no, fine.
Bernadette.
Yes, great. With respect to the resiliency, one of the things I think we should be encouraged, the whole issue of sharing infrastructure by competitive market players, open access and infrastructure, governments investing in facilities that can be leased out or shared by players in the market. The other thing that I want to speak to just briefly is the whole issue of the availability of spectrum. That wireless technologies are critical in this whole area of resiliency, especially when you consider the climate effects that are happening, that are destroying, the destructive, I should say, climate effects, the availability and the efficient and effective use of spectrum. And the third thing is the whole issue of governments digitally transforming. If they do it well, it's going to catalyze the uptake of ICT services. It's going to set the stage for widespread adoption of ICT. And already in the pandemic, we are seeing the pressure that the operators have been put under because of the demand. But I think that there is a lot of room for innovation. Gordon just spoke it out. The services are changing rapidly. People are experimenting. And it is important, even from the point of view that the networks are agile, that they are resilient for taking us through to the end of this, whatever the end is of this pandemic environment, and also for the challenges that will come in the future. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. What strikes me kind of listening to this conversation this afternoon is, I mean, first of all, we've had a rich conversation about the effect that the WTO reference paper has had on the industry over this kind of extraordinary kind of 25-year period of, as others have said, most remarkable technological change, process of change which has been accelerated. And I kind of come back to, I think, Leona's marvelous example of kind of 5 to 8 year advancement just in the kind of the year and a half of the pandemic. But also I was struck at kind of those concluding comments from our panelists about, you know, kind of how much this goes above and beyond simply the issues around the WTO reference paper and the importance of sort of trying to update that and trying to bring it into the JSI on e-commerce, but to the broader issues that you were raising there too, whether those be about spectrum availability, about supply chain bottlenecks in key components like semiconductors, or nationality rules that people are employing. So look, I mean, I wanted to thank all four of you for what I thought was a really interesting, thought-provoking discussion on an issue that is, of course, of such importance and has such a profile, after particularly after the last year and a half, and as we all sort of seek to find ways in which WTO, but also indeed ITU and others, where we're very active in supporting some of these projects to help address the digital divide, how we can all, working together collaboratively, address some of these problems in the interests of business, but also of consumers and end users of telecommunication technologies. And I just wanted to conclude, other than thanking our four excellent speakers, by thanking the Computer and Communications Industry Association for sponsoring this panel and making it all possible this afternoon, but also to pay a special tribute to Tilman Kupfer of BT, who's behind this panel, and I believe it may even be his last day in the job. So you, I know, have been a great friend to us, my mission, and to respect to many people across the industry and to many of those involved and listening in today. So Tilman, thank you very much. The very best of luck with whatever comes next. And thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon, whether it's the brave few down here in room S2 of the WTO who are missing the beautiful autumnal day, or those of you who are joining online and perhaps are able to witness it in person. Thank you very much indeed. Have a very good weekend, and thank you for being part of WTO Public Forum 2021.
Thank you.